Just an update on some of our sick folks that we've been announcing. As Bill mentioned in his prayer, Ray England did get out of the hospital and he got to go home, but there are some other tests that had to be done sometime on him. Deb had sent a message saying that her and H at Homer are doing much better now. Hopefully they will be here next Sunday, and wanted to thank everyone for all of the calls, the texts, the cards, and all that this congregation has done. So she just wanted us to be aware of that. I'm going to continue my series that I've been working on the Beatitudes. We're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 5 and verse 5 for tonight. And this is the blessed are the gentle, blessed are the meek. So to start off with, let's ask some questions. Are you impatient? Are you overbearing? Are you hot-tempered? Then listen as Jesus gives the third requirement of happiness plus. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. And many are familiar with the King James wording, which says, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. The world attaches little value to being gentle and meek. The Beatitudes of the world are more like this. Blessed are those who assert themselves, for they shall get their way. Blessed are those who promote themselves, for they shall be noticed. Blessed are the aggressive, for they shall succeed. Well, nevertheless, Jesus said, blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. And the last part of that promise, they shall inherit the earth, has brought about imaginations and produced considerable controversy. And what did Jesus mean when he said that the gentle, the meek, shall inherit the earth? And further, what does being gentle and meek have to do with our being happy? We'll consider these questions in this lesson tonight. We first need to determine the biblical meaning of the word gentle and meek. And unlike previous lessons that we've done in this series, we're going to begin with the positive, then we're going to go to the negative. First, we will see what the Greek word means, and then we'll think about what it does not mean. What gentleness, meekness is. And the word translated gentle or meek is the Greek word pros, P-R-A-U-S. And Joseph Henry Thayer's lexicon defines pros as gentle, mild, and meek. The Greek philosopher Aristotle said that pros is halfway between bad temper and spineless incompetence, the middle ground between extreme anger and indifference. Hugo McCord wrote, when pros was used of animals, the Greeks had the meaning of taming. When they used the word of sound, they meant it was gentle and soft. And when they used it of persons, they meant the people were meek and gentle. Well, let us begin our discussion by noting the need for gentleness. Christians are to put on the heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, Colossians 3:12. And as we teach the gospel and we attempt to rescue the lost, we should do so in the spirit of gentleness, Galatians 6:1. We have a word that has hardly lost its meaning, its original meaning, and that word is gentleman. Today, that word is primarily used to distinguish between a male and a female. But at one time, it referred to a man who was actually gentle in dealing with others. The Bible teaches that we all need to be gentle men and gentle women. A Greek dictionary says in chapter 5, verse 5, the meek to whom the inheritance is promised are those who acknowledge the great and gracious will of God. In this series, we are emphasizing the logical progression of the Beatitudes. One sees himself as nothing, the first beatitude, and God is everything. He mourns over his spiritual condition, the second beatitude, which causes him to repent and turn to God. Then his spiritual poverty and deep sorrow result in a gentle, meek, yielding spirit, the third beatitude, which accepts God's will without question. Having a spirit that is compliant toward God also benefits our relationship with others. Paul told Titus to remind Christians to be peaceable, gentle, showing every consideration for all men. Titus chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. The gentle, meek Christian does not insist in having his own way. He takes into account the needs and the feelings of others. Well, how then might we define the gentleness or the meekness of Matthew 5 and 5? It is a humble spirit that yields to the will of God and deals kindly with others. Well, what gentleness, meekness is not? Having discussed what pros is, we're ready to reach several conclusions regarding what pros is not. First, it should now be obvious that pros is not a weak quality. Some wonder about the word meek. To them, being meek meant that a person was timid and afraid to stand up for himself, that he allowed people to mistreat him and take advantage of him. Many translations, or modern translations, use other terms such as gentle and humble, but most would also view a gentle person as the opposite of a strong person. Remember that the Greeks used pros in speaking of taming animals. When I think of taming animals, I think of people like Steve Milliken that breaks wild horses to be ridden. When a horse is broken to ride, none of his strength is destroyed. Instead, the horse's strength becomes controlled. The gentleness, meekness of verse 5 can be thought of as strength under control. And regarding our relationship with the Lord, pros can be defined as strength tempered by reverence. And second, it is not an attitude of mind that is tolerant of anything and everything, even that which is wrong and immoral. Some people are thought of as meek and gentle because they never disagree with anyone. They go to great lengths to avoid any kind of unpleasantness. It is true that gentleness, meekness of verse 5 implies an individual who seeks peace, but this does not mean that he is tolerant of evil. To fail to oppose sin and error is not gentleness and meekness. And third, pros is not a natural disposition of mind. It is true that some individuals naturally exhibit some of the characteristics of meekness and gentleness. And these individuals are sometimes referred to as mild-mannered. This is not what Jesus had in mind when he used this word. Jesus was advocating a quality that every Christian needs to develop, whether or not he is naturally inclined to do it. He was speaking of an attribute that requires divine help to develop. In Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23, Paul spoke of the fruit of the Spirit, and included in Paul's list of fruit is gentleness or meekness. We become gentle and meek people in the biblical sense only as we yield ourselves to the Lord and let His Spirit work in our lives. By now, you can see that pros is a rather complex word. Perhaps it would help our understanding of this word if we saw biblical examples of it. Many examples can be found in the Scriptures, but we're going to confine ourselves to two examples, one in the Old Testament and one in the New. In the Old Testament, we read in Numbers 12 and 3, "Now the man Moses was very meek above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. And think about what you know of Moses. He was the meekest man alive, but was he weak? Could a weak man have led 2 to 3 million people out of Egypt? Moses was gentle and meek, but I remember occasions when his temper flared. You remember when he killed the Egyptian taskmaster, when he broke the first set of tablets of stone, when he struck a rock instead of speaking to it. And I doubt that meekness was his natural disposition. Well, nevertheless, he had the qualities that we've been discussing tonight. He had yielded his spirit to God's Spirit, and that affected how he treated others. He was not gentle or meek when it came to opposing disobedience to God, but he was still characterized by humility. 2 illustrations from Moses' life should help us. In Numbers chapter 11, a young man ran to Moses to report that 2 men were prophesying in the camp. A proud leader might have protested. Who gave them permission to do that? And Joshua said, "Moses, my Lord, restrain them." And Moses humbly replied, "Are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his Spirit upon them." And in chapter 12, the chapter which we read about Moses' humility and meekness, Miriam and Aaron spoke harshly about their brother. And the Lord rebuked the 2 and punished Miriam, who evidently had been the leader of this criticism of their brother. Now, if I'd been Moses, I might have said it's what she deserves. Instead, he prayed for his sister. "Oh God, heal her, I pray." Well, no wonder Moses was such a great leader. Now, turning to the New Testament, we find the greatest example of gentleness and meekness anywhere, anytime, and that's Jesus Christ. And we read in Matthew chapter 21, verse 5, which refers to the Messiah as gentle, sitting on a coat. In 2 Corinthians 10:1, Paul referred to the meekness and gentleness of Christ. And Jesus himself said, "I am gentle and humble in heart," Matthew 11:29. So the question is asked, was Jesus weak? Think about the money changers in the temple scrambling to get out of his way in John chapter 2. Was Jesus tolerant of evil? Did he avoid unpleasantness at all cost? Consider his scathing rebuke of the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23. Well, why was Jesus described as gentle or meek? He had totally yielded his will to do that of the Father. John 6:38. He had emptied himself of divine rights and privileges and had become the servant of God and mankind. Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 8. He was not concerned about himself, but was concerned about others. Matthew 20 and 28. So he was therefore gentle in dealing with the lost, and he was known as a friend of sinners. Matthew 11:19. A striking example of Jesus' meekness and gentleness is found in John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. And the scribes and the Pharisees, trying to trap Jesus, brought an adulterous woman to him. And after Jesus evaded their trap and the woman's accusers left him, he asked her, "Did no one condemn you?" And she said, "No one, Lord." Then Jesus said gently, "I do not condemn you either. Go, from now on, sin no more." Jesus was strong, but his strength was controlled. It was tempered by reverence for God and love for people. And that is what gentleness and meekness is that we're talking about from verse 5. Jesus said that those who have the attribute are blessed. They have happiness plus. And what does gentleness, meekness have to do with happiness? As was true regarding the previous Beatitudes, the attitude itself is conducive to being happy because the gentle and the meek person thinks more about the needs of others than of his own needs. And therefore, unlike most people in the world, he's not filled with discontent over the failure of others to meet his needs. Once again, however, the emphasis in our text is in the happiness as a result of the promise. And the promise is striking. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. Now, what does this mean? In what sense do the gentle and the meek inherit the earth? Well, this promise does not mean that those who are gentle and meek will inherit the earth in a legal sense. Consider the two examples of gentleness and meekness that we've discussed tonight, Moses and Jesus. McCord wrote, "If anyone were to think that this literal earth is what Jesus had in mind, then the meekest man who ever lived failed to receive the promise. Moses wandered with no home for 40 years, hoping to inherit the promised land, but he only got to look at it in Deuteronomy chapter 34. The Bible tells us also that Jesus was a meek man and yet far from inheriting the earth literally. Jesus said, 'Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head.' Luke chapter 9, verse 58. I'm sure you've heard and read, I have, articles in which people contend that Christians will one day own legal title to the physical earth. And their favorite text is this one right here, Matthew 5:5. Blessed are the gentle or the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. For instance, there are premillennialists who make this promise part of their end times scenario. They say that Jesus will return to earth and reign in a physical way for 1,000 years. And during that time, they insist that God's children will inherit the earth. And then there are those who teach that only 140,000 will go to heaven, while the rest of God's people will live forever here on this earth. They describe an earth cleansed of sin and wickedness, an earth with no sickness and death, an earth filled with happiness. Isn't that exciting, they ask? Actually, it's somewhat disappointing if you ask me. I've been looking to a new heaven, a new earth, as told in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 13, Revelation 21:1. And all you've promised me is a patched up, remodeled earth. And even a child knows the difference between new clothing and a patched up clothing. The Bible does not teach that the gentle, the meek, will inherit the earth as a legal possession now. Nor does it say that they will possess it in that sense later. Peter wrote that the day of the Lord will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the elements will be destroyed with intense heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10. Well, what then does the promise mean? In what sense do the meek and the gentle inherit the earth? And as was the case with the promises already studied, the promise is not physical in nature, but spiritual. The disciples of Jesus were hoping the Messiah would be a military leader who would conquer the earth and then give it to them to rule. And Jesus dashed these hopes when he said, "My kingdom is not of this world." John 18:36. However, even if we agree that the promise is spiritual in nature, that still leaves the matter of whether the earth in our text has to do with the life that is now or the life to come. And some insist that the promise has reference to this life only. And others insist just as strongly that the promise cannot refer to this life, so it must be talking about the one to come. Now let me again suggest that the promise will have a twofold fulfillment. partial fulfillment in this life, and complete fulfillment in the life to come. Let's notice in this life. In the Old Testament, David used basically the same language used by Jesus when he wrote, "But the humble will inherit the land and will delight themselves in abundant prosperity." Psalm 37, verse 11. The King James has a similarity to the first part of that verse. That's like the third beatitude that we're looking at, which is more striking. And the King James says in Psalm 37, "But the meek shall inherit the earth." So in Psalm 37, the humble, the meek, are those who trust in the Lord and patiently wait for Him to punish evildoers. Of greatest interest to us, however, is the word land or earth. In the psalm, the land earth refers to the geographical area that are known as the land of Canaan. And only the humble and meek, David insisted, would enjoy the blessings of that land. And even so, I believe that it is only the meek and the gentle who have the capacity to enjoy the blessings of this present earth to the fullest extent. It is the gentle and the meek Christian who inherits the earth in terms of inheriting the richest, fullest, and most satisfying life that this earth has to give. Paul spoke of this kind of life when he referred to himself as having nothing yet possessing all things. 2 Corinthians 6 and 10. And he gave the Corinthians this assurance: "For all things belong to you, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or things present or things to come. All things belong to you, and you belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to God." 2 Corinthians 3, 21, 23. One writer wrote, "All worthwhile things of this world are the possession of the meek. They may not legally own a square inch of land, but they recognize that the entire earth is Jehovah's, and that all its beauty and grandeur is theirs to enjoy." Most of us probably know of individuals who have great wealth but are most miserable, as well as those who have very little who are truly happy. It is not the abundance of possessions that makes us happy, but our attitude toward life. Don Humphrey noted that the real enjoyment of blessings is for those who hold earthly things lightly, who rank them inferior to spiritual blessings. And he noted that a meek person is not burdened by his possessions and is not consumed by the fear of losing those possessions. And what about the life to come? More can be said about the gentle and the meek inheriting the best that this earth has to offer. But let us turn our attention to the life to come. As is the case with all the Beatitudes, the ultimate fulfillment of this promise will be in heaven one day. In Hebrews 11, we read concerning the heroes of faith. In verses 13 through 16, it says, "All these died in faith, without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared a city for them." 2 chapters later, the writer says, "For here, on this earth, we do not have a lasting city, but we are seeking the city which is to come, that is, heaven." Chapter 13, verse 14. In Romans chapter 8, Paul wrote about our spiritual inheritance. And he said that we are heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with Him, so that He may also be glorified with Him. Verse 17. He recognized that our blessings in this life will always be mixed with suffering. So he looked forward to the life to come. And he said, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed." And as he neared the end of his life, he wrote, "The Lord will rescue me from every evil deed and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. To him be glory forever and ever. Amen." 2 Timothy 4:18. The ultimate and final fulfillment of this promise to inherit the earth will come in a new heaven and a new earth. Revelation 21:1. The abode of heaven, of God himself in heaven. There could be no greater incentive to strive to be what we should be. As we conclude tonight, let's again look at that verse again. "Blessed are the gentle," or the meek, "for they shall inherit the earth." Do you want to inherit the earth? To enjoy the best of what this earth has to offer and look forward to the new earth? Then you must be gentle and meek. Remember that gentleness and meekness involve more than just speaking softly and being kind to others. Some consider this to be the most difficult of the Beatitudes because it involves total submission to the will of God. The proud person says to God, "I don't need you. I don't need your way." The gentle, the meek person says, "God, I recognize my weakness, and I realize that I have nothing to offer of value to you. But I am thankful that you love me, that you gave your Son to die for me, and that you made the way of salvation clear. Now I humbly submit to your will." Now, if you're not a child of God tonight, you have that opportunity to do so. Be buried with him and baptized, raised to walk in newness of life, and live faithfully from now on. Or if you are an unfaithful child, show your humility by coming to the Lord today. If you need to respond, won't you come now as we gather, we stand, and we sing. Have you a heart that's weary? Then you a load of care. Are you a soul that's seeking rest from the burden you bear? Do you know my Jesus? Do you know my friend? Have you heard he loves you and that he